In the sleepy town of Marston, everyone knew everyone else. Doors were seldom locked, and neighbors greeted each other with friendly waves. But there was one house that stood apart, cloaked in an aura of mystery and dread. It belonged to Mrs. Evelyn Crowley, an elderly woman who rarely ventured out and never entertained visitors. Mrs. Crowley's house was a dilapidated relic, with peeling paint and overgrown weeds. Children dared each other to approach it, whispering tales of ghostly apparitions and strange sounds. Most of these stories were brushed off as childish nonsense, but there was one tale that lingered in the minds of the townfolk, the tale of the silent neighbor. Every night, at precisely midnight, a figure could be seen standing in the attic window of Mrs. Crowley's house. It was a man, or at least the silhouette of one. He never moved, never made a sound, just stood there watching. Those who dared to look longer claimed they could feel his eyes boring into their souls. One particularly foggy night, Sarah Mitchell, a journalist with a passion for mysteries, decided to unravel the secret of the silent neighbor. Armed with a flashlight and a camera, she made her way to Mrs. Crowley's house. The air was thick with tension as she crept up the creaky front steps and knocked on the door. To her surprise, Mrs. Crowley answered almost immediately. The old woman seemed frail, her eyes sunken and weary, but there was an unexpected kindness in her voice. "Come in, dear," she said softly. "I knew someone would come eventually." Inside, the house was a maze of shadows and forgotten memories. Dust-covered furniture and cobweb-trapped chandeliers painted a picture of abandonment. Mrs. Crowley led Sarah up a narrow staircase to the attic. "He's up there," she whispered. "Go and see for yourself." With a mix of fear and determination, Sarah ascended the final steps and pushed open the attic door. The room was cold and dark, illuminated only by the moonlight streaming through the window. And there he was, the silent neighbor, standing as still as ever, heart pounding. Sarah approached the figure, raising her flashlight. As the beam of light fell upon him, she gasped. The silent neighbor was a mannequin, expertly crafted and eerily lifelike. Its eyes, though made of glass, seemed to follow her every move. "But why?" Sarah muttered to herself, turning to Mrs. Crowley, who had followed her up. The old woman sighed, her eyes filled with sorrow. "50 years ago," Mrs. Crowley began, "my husband, Thomas, went missing. He was a kind man, always helping others. One night he simply vanished without a trace. I searched for him everywhere, but he was gone. I couldn't bear the thought of living alone, so I created him, this mannequin, to keep me company. But as the years passed, he became something more. He began to watch over me, just as Thomas did." Sarah shivered, a chill running down her spine. "You mean he's alive?" Mrs. Crowley shook her head. "Not alive, no, but he protects me. He keeps the house safe from intruders. You are the first person I have allowed inside in decades." As Sarah turned to leave, she felt a sudden overwhelming urge to look back at the mannequin. To her horror, it had moved. Its head was now turned, its glass eyes locked onto her. "Thank you for visiting, dear," Mrs. Crowley said softly, guiding Sarah out of the attic. But I think it's time for you to go. Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She hurried down the stairs and out of the house, her heart racing. As she reached the street, she glanced back one last time. The attic window was dark, but she could still feel the silent neighbor's gaze. The next day, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She returned to Mrs. Crowley's house, only to find it abandoned. The old woman was gone, and the house was eerily quiet. Determined to uncover the truth, Sarah did some digging and discovered that Mrs. Evelyn Crowley had passed away 20 years ago. The house had been empty ever since, but every night at precisely midnight, the silhouette of the silent neighbor still appeared in the attic window, watching.